Chelsea, welcome back. Today, we are going to talk about real estate closings and some of the things, some of the myths that cost buyers and sellers lots of money. We're going to cover a bunch of different myths. We're also going to talk a little bit about Orlando and Central Florida for some of the things that affect us, buyers and sellers here in Central Florida. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you. I'm excited to talk about all of the myths that costs all of my clients unnecessary amounts of money.
Awesome. Okay, so you've sat across from hundreds of buyers and sellers at the closing table. What's the most common look you see on people's faces when they realize that they were wrong about how this process works?
Um, Panic, shock. That often turns to anger, but it all just stems from fear and misunderstanding, and the fear of, well, what happens now?
Cool. Yeah, I know I've been at that table a few times, and it's always interesting to look down that settlement sheet of all the different things and costs that most of us just really don't understand. Um, So how much money in real dollar terms would you say that the average buyer or seller loses because of myths that they had about closing? So give us an average number.
Um, well, it obviously depends on if we're talking about a buyer or a seller and, where in the transaction the loss comes into play. But I would say anywhere between 5,000 to 50,000 or more. From the buyer side, you can lose your deposit. So depending on the amount of the deposit, you're going to lose that. You'll have already spent money on your inspection, your appraisal. You're going to lose those funds. You may have already bought a survey, so you're going to lose that. And then from the seller side, you also have the deposit. Like that deposit is your liquidated damages. So understanding when you get that back and when you don't is very important. And then depending on where the seller where the seller is in the transaction, is this their primary residence? Have they already put themselves under contract to buy a new home? Have they already moved? All of those types of considerations will come into play when we're talking about how much money either party has to lose. And we're talking about myths. I think the one of the primary myths is the only thing that I have to lose is the deposit. That's absolutely not true.
Hmm. Okay, so let's cover the myths now, and let's start with the big one because I think I had this myth at some point, I'm sure. The myth being that my real estate agent is going to handle everything, including the legal stuff. So, what are agents actually authorized to do, and where does their role stop?
Um, so they they can do a lot. I don't want to diminish what they are able to do. They really essentially are responsible for bringing parties together. So whether they're representing the buyer or the seller, they're finding someone to buy a property that is being sold. And they're bringing those parties together and identifying the primary terms of the agreement. Once they identify those primary terms, that's essentially where their ability to negotiate ends. They are allowed to fill out the very basic standard purchase and sale document forms. There are standard forms for residential, there's vacant land, there is commercial. Um, they can, like I said, they can fill in those forms, but once it goes beyond just filling in the blanks or checking the checkbox, that's where their ability to negotiate and draft ends, and anything beyond that is the unlicensed practice of law.
So, when someone finds out that their agent can't really give legal advice and they don't have an attorney like you, what tends to go wrong? Like, walk us through a real world scenario.
Yeah, so from the perspective of my office, what happens is they panic and they start Googling attorney and calling everyone as quickly as possible, trying to get an attorney who can get involved immediately. We get calls like that pretty regularly. Sometimes my schedule allows me to get on a phone and give some advice to someone or take on the representation in an urgent rushed manner, but other times I'm a little bit too busy and I'm not able to do that. But to answer your question, what happens is They're frustrated. We've had many situations where people have said, "Nobody told me until today that I needed to have an attorney review this, and now I only have X number of days to get this response back or have this reviewed. I need someone as soon as possible." So it creates a very flustered, panicked situation, and the likelihood of being able to find a good attorney who can jump on it quickly is pretty low.
Okay. So let's talk now a little bit about closing costs. Buyers, I guess, often will assume that they're fixed or that they're going to be roughly the same no matter who they use, who they work with. What's actually regulated and what isn't? What can change?
So for a buyer and for a seller, I guess, the title insurance premiums are promulgated by Florida statute. But there are certain items of the title insurance that are only a statutory minimum requirement to collect. So, for instance, there are several endorsements that the minimum requirement is that we collect $25. That is something that often gets increased. Um, what I typically see, a standard doesn't really alarm me is if the increase is around 200 to 250, but I have seen in the past companies increase those minimum requirements for payment up to 750 over $1,000 for an endorsement. Um, Another thing that can change are the settlement fees. For the most part, I think companies are sort of held to pretty standard, just because we do keep an eye on what a customary charge for a settlement fee could be. But those are also things that could change depending on the office. Would be the settlement fees.
So, are there some of those fees that the buyers have like the most leverage to shop around on? Which ones are they? And are there a lot? Are there some fees, and which ones do you see that buyers are just most likely to accept without even asking?
Buyers are most likely to accept the settlement fee. I think for the most part, at least in Central Florida, buyers don't have really broad authority to negotiate the title fees because it's standard for the seller to choose the company that's going to close a transaction. So one thing that I would recommend, I guess, whenever I'm representing a buyer pre-contract, what we do is we'll reach out to the title company or law office that the seller has stated that they're using, and we ask for a estimated settlement statement just so that we can see what those fees are going to be before we are contractually obligated to use that company.
Okay. Now you are based in Winter Garden, and this area of West Orange County, South Lake County, in Central Florida, cities, towns, communities like Horizon West, Claremont, Leesburg, Mineola are booming right now. There's new construction everywhere. What's in the builder's contract that most buyers don't realize puts them at a disadvantage? And can they negotiate some of those builders' contracts?
Well, it depends on the builder. I have been working with several clients this year negotiating construction contracts, and given the current environment, they're especially the smaller builders are seeming more willingly to negotiate their contracts right now. But yes, to answer your question, they are at a disadvantage if they want that specific builder and that specific house and that specific location. Then for the most part, they're gonna have to accept the terms that the contractor, is offering. So my goal when I'm representing a buyer of new construction is maybe to negotiate some terms, but really just to make sure that my client understands the contract that they're signing, because at the end of the day, it's their decision if they wanna accept the terms that the contractor is offering. I just wanna make sure that they're making an informed decision.
That's really helpful. Um, so one of the last things we can talk about here, because we have a lot of master plan communities now, and that's CDD fees. What is a CDD fee? It seems to confuse buyers constantly. What's the myth? What's the reality? Have you seen people getting burned by it?
Yeah, absolutely. CDDs are they confuse everyone, to be honest. I had a situation last week where I had to explain even to my underwriter that, "Hey, this fee is paid to the CDD on the tax bill. It's not a separate assessment like an HOA, so we need to remove these requirements for an HOA estoppel. But it really depends on the CDD as well. Some of them have the CDD fees, and then depending on where the property is located within that CDD, they might also have an association fee that they have to pay. The primary area I see this actually cost people money is if you're selling or buying a property located in a CDD. There's an area of the contract that dictates whether or not the seller is going to be responsible for fully paying any of those assessments that are due prior to closing. And if there's an upcoming assessment, it could be relatively large, depending on which box is checked. That could end up costing either the buyer or the seller thousands of dollars that they weren't expecting. So that's just something to consider and look further into if you are buying or selling a property that's located within a CDD.